we got logged out of Zoom, and it's been a week. I thought yesterday was terrible technology Tuesday. we had issues with Zoom, we had issues with Teams.
Today is Weird Wednesday.
And today is Weird Wednesday. But thank you, St. Mary's, for doing Week of Understanding again, and thank you for tuning in to my friend Jen. Because as you well know, Mrs. Sheridan, the firsthand testimony is the best way to learn Holocaust education. So we are really grateful to George. George Elbaum was born in Warsaw, Poland, but is coming to us today from San Francisco. So we are very grateful for him to Zoom in and talk to your classes today. And since it is just St. Mary's today, hopefully there'll be lots of time for good questions and conversation at the end. So we'll give him a couple minutes here to set up his PowerPoint.
Now, should I put in, I tell you, can you put in the PowerPoint? Can you put in the PowerPoint, Kale?
Oh, I just got a message. Scott, do you have the PowerPoint?
Let me send it to you, Kale, because then.
Okay.
So.
And Carol, can you still hear me? But you.
Yes, and I see him now. He's
okay. Oh, great. Oh, good.
He's just on the side panel. He's not in the
right, because he's sharing his screen.
Right. I'm going to pin him.
Okay.
And George, if you will stop screen sharing when I get your PowerPoint. I did not realize we were going to do that for you. I apologize. Weird Wednesday it is indeed.
Kale, I just sent it to you.
All right.
I can get him to stop screen sharing. I'll take that. Let me go to participants. George.
Okay, here we go.
Okay,
I just stopped screen sharing.
Okay,
right.
Kale will do the sharing now, and we should be right there.
Can we see it?
Yes,
yeah,
and there you go, George. You should be all set.
Now I should, okay, security alert, okay.
Where Kale is ready for you.
Okay, so should I now push screen share?
Nope, you don't have to. You just
tell her when you need to advance.
Yep, just tell me when you want me to advance.
Good, yeah, that's exactly what I thought we might run into, and it happens. Okay, good. Okay, I'm ready. You want to start?
You can go ahead and start, George.
Thank you. I muted myself and couldn't find the mute button. Oof. Go right ahead, George.
Okay. So first of all, here it's still morning. So good morning here. Good afternoon in Omaha. I'd like to tell you guys about the world I was born into. A dangerous world that I survived, but only because of major luck, in a world that I hope none of you ever have to experience. The place, Warsaw, Poland. The time, September 1939. Hitler's Nazi armies invade Poland, and that starts World War II. With hundreds of airplanes, slide please, next slide. So 100 airplanes, next slide. Thousands of tanks, next slide. 1 million troops, the Nazi army sweeps across Poland and conquers it in 1 month. Next slide. Then they hold a victory parade on the streets of Warsaw. Next slide. And even Hitler himself comes to view it. That's Hitler with his arm outstretched. Now, I was born in Warsaw. I lived there at the time, but I don't remember this because I was only 1 year old. But I remember most things since I was 3. And at that time, when Hitler invaded Poland, I had a family of 12 people, parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles. Within 3 years, out of the 12 people, only my mother and I were still alive. The other 10 were all dead, murdered by the Nazis. Why? Because they were Jewish. As you probably know, the stated goal of the Nazi party was to exterminate, to kill everyone who they considered undesirable. Jews were on top of the list, but there were others, gypsies, invalids, gays, socialists, handicapped people. But Jews were on top of the list and the largest group. And at that time, when Hitler invaded Poland, there's about 3.5 million Jews living in the country. By the end of the war, 5 years later, 90% of them, 9 out of every 10 were dead, murdered by the Nazis. What became known as the Holocaust was the murder of 6 million Jews during the 5 years of the war. Now, 6 million is a huge number. It's not a human number. I can't feel it, and I doubt if many of you can also feel what 6 number means. So I'm going to try to put it into more human terms. And first, let's take the step of looking at averages. 6 million murdered in 5 years. That averages to 1,200,000 every year, or 100,000 every month. 100,000 people murdered every month on the average. That's still a huge number. But consider something more human. The population of Omaha, it's about 400,000. That means that the rate of killing 100,000 Jews every month, it's equivalent of killing every person, every man, woman, and child living now in Omaha every 4 months, and repeating it 15 times over during the 5 years of the war. So 6 million is essentially 15 times the size of Omaha. And that is what 6 million means. That's what the Holocaust means. I don't think there's never been in the history of the world murder to that extent. So in addition to the cruelty and inhumanity of murder on what I call an industrial scale, you can also ask yourself, how is it possible to do that? How is it possible to kill every man, woman, and child living in Omaha today and repeat it over and over and over again 15 times over a period of 5 years? How is it possible? How do you do that? How do you build a murder machine of that sort? Well, the Nazis were very efficient, at least when it came to the process of murder. And the way they did it is in each of the countries that they conquered, they chose 1 or 2 or 3 major cities that already had a large Jewish population. And in those cities, they established what became known as the ghetto. I'll just be talking about the Warsaw Ghetto. That was the biggest ghetto that the Nazis established. And I remember it because I lived there. And my family lived there. So in Warsaw, the Nazis established, they chose an area, it's about 2% of the area of Warsaw, although the Jewish population of Warsaw was 30%. So they chose a small area, 2%, right within the heart of the Jewish district, which happens to be where my family lived at the time. And they built a wall around it, a brick wall with barbed wire on top, with the gates that were guarded by soldiers, with dogs and machine guns. And once the wall was erected, the Nazis swept the rest of the country, the rest of Warsaw, the other 98% of Warsaw, around this small 2% ghetto. And they collected the Jews that lived outside of the wall. There was about 80%. And they collected them all and they forced them into the ghetto. And then the Nazis swept the whole countryside, the smaller towns and villages, the whole Warsaw region, collected all the Jews that lived there. Some of those towns had populations of up to 50% Jewish. They collected Jews from all there, and then they forced them all into the ghetto. So think about it. Think what would happen if you were to build a wall in the heart of Omaha that contains 100,000 people, whereas there's 400,000 total. And then you take the 300,000 that lived outside the wall and you force them into that walled-in area that's already fully occupied. And then you collect another 300,000 from the whole Omaha region, and you force that in also into this small walled-in area in the center of Omaha. Where would these people live? There's only room for the people already living in the walled-in area. That's exactly what happened in Warsaw. That's exactly what happened. And I remember when I was about 3 years old, well, first of all, if the people that were being forced in from the outside were lucky, because they had friends or relatives living in the ghetto, like we did, who lived there, then these people who are lucky would move in with their friends or relatives. And I remember I was about 3 years old. Suddenly there's like a dozen strangers moved into the apartment, which at that time, only my mother, my grandmother, and I were there. The men in the family, like my grandfather, my uncle, they've already been taken away by the Nazis. They were all dead by then, but we didn't know about it until after the war. So these strangers that moved in, they were sleeping on the couches, on the floor, in the kitchen, in the hallway. And I remember asking my mother, who are these people? What are they doing here? And my mom said, well, they're friends. They'll be with us for a little while. And yeah, they were with us for a little while. But once the Nazis were satisfied, they've collected Jews from the whole Warsaw region and forced them all into the ghetto. They started to take people out of the ghetto, putting them in trains and shipping them to concentration camps, and most of them to the gas chambers. So rather than telling you about it, I'm going to read to you a chapter of a book that I wrote 10 years ago. Actually, almost 11 years ago. The book is called Neither Yesterdays Nor Tomorrows. And if we have time, I'll tell you that I was inspired to write this book by a small middle school in a small town in Tennessee. I've never been there, never met anybody from there. But they inspired me to write this book after I was silent about my Holocaust childhood for 60 some years. The chapter I'll read to you is called Umschlagplatz, which in German means collection point or shipping point. Now, I do not speak German. I never did. The first time I heard the word Umschlagplatz was when I was 4 years old. I'm 82 now, so that was 78 years ago. I've never forgotten that. Umschlagplatz. Suddenly there was loud shouting coming from the courtyard. Then the entire apartment complex was filled with ear-splitting noise. Shouts, screams, doors banging everywhere, and heavy running footsteps. My grandmother ran into the room holding my coat, grabbed my hand, and led me to the staircase, which was filled with people, all going downstairs. When we reached the courtyard, it was already full of people, crowded together in groups, with soldiers in dark green uniforms, shouting orders and walking between the groups. My grandmother held my hand tightly as we were pushed back and forth by the crowd, till finally we were standing at the edge of our group, facing the large arched entry gate that led from the street into our courtyard. It seemed that we stood there a long, long time, and I recall being glad that my grandmother put my coat on because I was getting cold. And I remember seeing some groups being led by soldiers out of the courtyard through the big gate. Next slide, please. Exactly the scene that you see there. You see the big gate in the back. People are being led out and they're guarded by soldiers with machine guns. Then suddenly I saw my mother running in through the gate, holding a piece of paper in her hand, showing that paper to some soldiers, talking with them, and finally coming to us, to my grandmother and me, and leading us out of the courtyard. It was only years later, after the war, did I understand what happened. The Nazis were emptying out the Warsaw Ghetto, apartment block at a time, and shipping the residents to concentration camps. My mother, who at that time was working at a factory in the ghetto, which the Nazis authorized the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee to manage and make uniforms for the Nazi army, somehow learned that our apartment block was being emptied out that day. She got from her factory director an official document allowing her to keep her family in place. With this document, in effect, a temporary permit to continue living. Think about that for a moment. That little piece of paper was a temporary permit for my grandmother and me to continue living. With this document, she managed to convince the Nazi officer commanding that day sweep to let us go. Had she arrived a few minutes later, it would have been too late. Because if my mom had arrived a few minutes later, my fate would be like the little boy that you see on your screen. Because he lived maybe another week or two longer after this photo was taken. Because from here, these people were taken directly to freight yards. Next slide, please. Put onto freight cars, cattle cars, and shipped directly to concentration camps. And once they got there, all children, most women, and all the older or weaker men would be almost immediately sent to the gas chambers. So if my mom had come in a few minutes later, it would have been too late. I would have been dead long ago. I would not be here with you today. Again, pure luck. Now, I mentioned if people were lucky when they were forced into the ghetto, then they would, because they were moving with friends or relatives. Well, what if they weren't lucky, if they didn't know anybody? Well, they would have to live on the street. And Warsaw is a northern city, like Seattle, New York, Toronto. Omaha gets pretty cold in the winter, I believe. It's not a good place to be living on the street. Because of that, during the 2.5 years of the ghetto's existence, 80,000 people died within the walls of the ghetto, most of them on the street. They died from starvation, they died from disease, they died from exposure to the elements. And I remember many winter mornings, I would be woken up by a sound, something like a clunk, 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 clunk. It was the sound of a big wooden wagon that was being pulled over the cobblestone streets of the ghetto by men. They would collect bodies of anybody that had died on the street during the night and taking the bodies out. The ghetto was not a good place to live, was not a good place to die. Next slide, please. Here you see a couple of kids sitting on the street, freezing, begging for food. There was no food to be given. We were all starving. What happened next? My mom was a very smart woman. And she realized that the days of the ghetto and everybody in it were numbered. So she decided to try to get us to safety when there was still a chance. And the first place in our flight to safety is that place I call the shed. Next slide, please. And the reason I put this on the cover of my book is that I remember that scene. It's a scene from the ghetto that I remember and had a major effect on my adult life, my professional life. So the first, I'll read to you this chapter called The Shed. We could only speak in whispers here, my grandmother told me. We were now in a large shed with corrugated metal walls and ceiling, pieces of rusting metal equipment strewn about, and our bags and blankets on the floor. Several families were here with us, though no one that I recognized, all with bags and suitcases and blankets. One family even had a little black dachshund, and its owners told us that it never barks. I petted his soft fur and I played with him. Some of the people played cards, some knitted, but no one spoke except in very quiet whispers. My grandmother took some bread and sausage from her bag, made tea on a little chemical burner, and that was our dinner. When it got dark, no one lit any candles. We wrapped ourselves in our blankets and we slept. I woke up in the morning and I wanted to play with the little black dachshund, but it was gone. So I asked its owners, where is it? And their only answer to me was, it's gone. Years later, my mom told me that during the night, its owners had to choke it to death to keep it from barking at footsteps outside the shed. If you guys have a small pet, a dog or a cat, can you imagine choking it to death on your own lap? I can't. The shed, or the day, or perhaps many days went by very slowly in the near silence, the only sounds coming from outside the shed. There was a big hole in the shed's roof through which I watched white clouds on the blue sky. Once I saw an airplane with black crosses on its wings flying across the sky, exactly what you see there. This is exactly the scene I remember. At that time, I didn't know that it was a Nazi airplane and the black crosses were Nazi insignia. It just looked so beautiful to me against the blue sky. It wasn't constrained in a dark shed as I was. I felt strangely drawn to it. I wanted to be in it. I wanted to be somehow with it. I never lost that feeling and interest in airplanes. A few years later, after the war, I would read Polish aviation magazines. Then later on in high school in Oregon, after we came to America, I would build and fly model airplanes. In college, I majored in aeronautical engineering. Then I worked in the aerospace industry, took flying lessons, got a private pilot's license, even crashed an airplane and walked away from it without a scratch. And then for 20-some years, I flew hang gliders in Southern California. Crashed maybe half a dozen times, walked away from all but the last one. And on that one, I crashed near the top of a mountain in Southern California. I woke up 6 hours later in a hospital. And my wife, for my next birthday, my wife gave me a video as a present. It shows the rescue the video was taken from a newsreel helicopter showing a rescue helicopter lifting me unconscious from the top of the hill and flying me off to hospital. However, I've never forgotten that airplane against the blue sky through the hole in the roof and the feeling of awe and exhilaration that it gave me. That's why I put it on the cover of my book, because it affected my life. What happened next? My mom put my grandmother into a bunker. It's a hiding place that was being built inside the ghetto. And my mom thought they should be safe through the end of the war. Turns out it wasn't safe, but we didn't know that until after the war. So thinking that my grandmother was safe, my mom smuggled herself and me out of the ghetto. What happened in the ghetto after we left? Enough information, including news, including some eyewitnesses actually managed to smuggle themselves back into the ghetto to warn everybody that the trains that were taking people away from the ghetto were taking them to concentration camps where most of them were dying in gas chambers. So a group of young civilians, several hundred of them, 400, 500, 600, they knew they could no longer get out of the ghetto. By that time, the Nazis had tightened security on the wall. And so they knew what's going to happen. They knew they would all die. And they chose to die fighting rather than die in the gas chambers. And they staged what became known as the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Now imagine a group of young civilians, let's say 400 or 500 of them, no military training. They had some rifles or some pistols hidden in the ghetto. And they rose up against a trained Nazi army of thousands of soldiers with tanks and artillery and airplanes. The ghetto fighters knew they had no chance. They knew they would all die. It was a hopeless act of defiance. They fought for about 2 or 3 weeks and they were all killed. Next slide, please. This is the photo taken at the end of the 2 or 3 weeks when the uprising was finally put down. Every man, woman, and child that remained in the ghetto was killed, every one of them. And apparently Hitler was so furious and so apparently personally insulted that the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto dared to rise up against his army. He ordered the army to destroy every building within the ghetto. Next slide, please. Here's a panoramic shot of the ghetto right after the uprising. Everything you see in front is ruins. That's the ghetto. And the black line in the back, those are the buildings of Warsaw right outside the walls of the ghetto. How did my mom and I survive outside the ghetto? Next slide, please. This is a photo of my mom together with her brother. She was 7 years old. It's the only photo she managed to save because she kept it under her blouse all the years of the war. My mom was a very smart woman. She was a young attorney before the war. At the university, she learned English and she learned French. So the first thing she did when she got herself and me out of the ghetto, she dyed her black hair blonde so she wouldn't look quite so Jewish. Most Poles have hair that's light brown or dark brown, not black. And then she bought the identification papers of a young Polish Catholic woman who had died and took on that woman's name. And the next time my mom saw me, because I didn't live with her once we were out of the ghetto, I'll tell you about that in a minute. My mom told me, your name is no longer Elbaum, because Elbaum is considered a Jewish name. From now on, your name is Schliboski, because that was the name of the woman whose paper she had, my mom bought. And she said, don't forget that, your name is Schliboski. My mom, throughout the end of the war, probably bought another 3 or 4 sets of fake ID papers to keep the Nazis off her trail. And whenever, the next time she would see me, she would tell me what my new name was, and I had to remember that. So my mom, with blonde hair, with fake ID papers, my mom went to work. First, she had some good jobs. She became an English governess or French governess to wealthy Poles who wanted their kids to learn those languages. Those good jobs ended. She took on some pretty miserable jobs. She became a cook, a maid, a scrub woman, even a laundress, anything. As long as the job came with 2 benefits. Benefit number 1, room and board in the apartment or the apartment of the people who hired her. And the reason that was critical is that she wouldn't have to walk to work on the street every day, because every time she was on the street, she could be picked up by Nazi patrol or police and sent to concentration camp, fake papers or not. Requirement number 2, a little bit of cash, not for herself, because she was getting room and board. She needed the cash to pay to the people who were keeping me. My mom decided that I would be safer if I was raised by Polish Catholic families together with their kids. My mom tells me that throughout the war, I was in age 3, 4, and 5, and 6. My hair was light brown, so I didn't look Jewish. It's only after the war that my hair turned dark brown and then eventually black like hers. And then about 10, 15 years ago, as you can probably see on your screen, it turned light again. If you kids don't know how that happens, ask your grandparents, they'll tell you. They also tell you what happened to you too. So my mom survived by luck, strength, and wits. I survived by luck only, and I'll give you an example of my luck. One of the first families with whom I was living, I remember I was sitting at a table eating soup. It must have been evening because I remember somebody was lighting a kerosene lamp on the table. There apparently was no electricity in that part of Warsaw at the time. So I'm sitting there eating soup. So all of a sudden there's loud banging on the front door and loud shouts in German. And everybody rushed to the front door, but I didn't. I just continued to sit there and eat soup. probably because I was hungry. I was hungry through most of the war years, but that was not unusual because there was not enough food in Poland and many people were hungry. And because I was kept by families of strangers, they often didn't feed me well. So I was hungry most of those years of the war. So I'm sitting there eating soup, ignoring this commotion that's behind me, people talking German, people talking Polish, and just ignoring it. So all of a sudden I sensed somebody was staring at me. And I remember I turned to the side like this, and there was a tall Nazi soldier staring straight down at me. I remember he had on this dark green coat, so it must have been winter time, because it looks like a heavy coat. And on his shoulder, he had a machine gun. It's the first time I've ever seen one, but it just fascinated me. Apparently, even at the age of 4, machinery fascinated me, which is why I eventually became an engineer. So I just kept looking at his gun and looking at it, staring at it. And then I looked at him and I smiled at him. I don't know why, nor why I still remember it, but I do. I smiled at him. And then I continued to eat soup and I ignored him. He stood there another moment or two, probably trying to decide what to do about me. And then he walked off and he and the other soldiers were gone and all was quiet. I learned after the war that had I shown any fear whatsoever, he would have made me drop my pants to see whether I was circumcised, because only Jews were circumcised in Poland at that time. And if that had happened, I would have never reached my 5th birthday. So again, pure luck. I lived with about 4 or 5 different Polish families throughout the war. My mom would move me from one to the next when the family with whom I was living alerted her to danger to me and danger to them. And the reason for that was that in Poland, the Nazis decreed that any Poles or Polish families caught hiding Jews would be immediately sent to concentration camps along with the Jews that were hiding. So these families that were keeping me, they weren't doing for the little bit of cash that my mom could pay them. She paid them all the money she was making. They were doing it because they thought was the right thing to do, even though they were risking perhaps their life. So I'm going to ask you a challenge question. I'd like you to think about it. And I'd like you to answer it honestly, but answer it only to yourself. But from the bottom of your heart, answer it honestly. Imagine that's now 20 years in the future. You finish with your education, or high school, college, whatever. And you're working somewhere in the Omaha area for a good company. And the company has a foreign office. And they offered you a major promotion if you move to that country to manage their office. And you accept it because it's a good promotion. When you get there, they have a house ready for you, an apartment, everything's set for you. But you learn that the government of that country is prejudiced against a small minority. And you know that you could save one of them. Imagine you could save a little skinny, undernourished 4-year-old kid, as I was at the time. You took him or her into your house or apartment, but you might be risking maybe your life. Would you do it? Would you do it? Please think about that, but answer it only to yourself. Would you do it? But the 4 or 5 different Polish families that took me in, they took that risk, they hid me. And that is the only reason I'm here with you today, because they saved me. The last family with whom I lived was headed by a man named Leon, and his is the only name I remember, just the first name. Probably because I liked him. I liked Leon because he was always fair to me. He was kind most of the time, but he was also tough. When I disobeyed him, when I did something I wasn't supposed to do, he beat me, and he beat me hard. But if that involved eating some food that I wasn't supposed to touch when I was alone in the apartment because I was hungry, sometimes it was even worth a beating. So I liked Leon. I didn't like his wife with their daughter, maybe a year younger than I, because whenever my mom would visit me, that might be once a month, once every several months. The last time I didn't see my mom for 6 months, my mom would bring me a present. It might be a little wooden toy, or it might be a hard-boiled egg, which was a nice present in wartime Poland when everybody was hungry. My mom always made sure that she was still there when I ate the egg. She wanted to see me eating the egg. She wanted to make sure that I got it. But after my mom would leave, Leon's wife very often would take away the little toy that my mom just brought me and give it to their daughter to play with. So I didn't like them. I was with Leon and his family from the beginning of 1944 through the end of the year. And that included August 44, time of the Warsaw Uprising. Now, the Warsaw Uprising differed from the ghetto uprising in one very fundamental way. As I said, the ghetto fighters knew they would all die. They had no chance. It was a hopeless act of defiance. The Warsaw fighters in August of 44 thought they had a chance. First of all, there's like 20,000 of them, and they were loyal to and supported by the Polish government in exile in London. So they had some weapons. They had some mortars, some machine guns that were airdropped to them from England by the Royal Air Force. But the main reason that the Polish fighters thought they had a chance was that by August 44, the Russian army had already pushed the Nazis out of Russia and out of eastern Poland. And the Russian army was sitting right at the edge of the river that cuts through Warsaw, just right on the other side of the river. And the Moscow radio was encouraging the fighters to start the uprising. So the Warsaw fighters expected that once the uprising started, which was the 1st of August, the Russian army would cross the river to help the fighters liberate Warsaw sooner, liberate Poland sooner, end the war sooner. That was a huge lie, a huge fake out on the part of the Russians. They had no intention of helping the Warsaw fighters because they decided long before this that every country they liberate from the Nazis, they would turn it into a communist satellite. So the last thing they wanted in Warsaw or Poland would be to have a Polish underground army, still armed, still loyal to the pro-Western government in London, resisting the communist takeover. So they just sat across the river, did absolutely nothing, and watched and waited while the Nazis killed off most of those 20,000 fighters and turned Warsaw into a total ruin. Next slide, please. This is what Warsaw looked like in October, November. It was about 3 or 4 months uprising, and every building in the center part of Warsaw looked like this. Nothing was but ruins. How did Leon and his family and I get out of there in time? Well, Leon must have apparently, I feel that he must have learned that the uprising was coming because somewhere he got a pedal-powered rickshaw. And right before the uprising started, he and his wife packed a whole bunch of suitcases and cardboard boxes. And in the morning, they loaded them on the pedal-powered rickshaw, and with his wife and daughter and I sitting on the luggage and Leon in the back pedaling, we left the city. The Warsaw Uprising had just started. About an hour out of the city, Leon finally, we were out in the countryside by then, he pulled over and stopped to rest because he was getting tired. And I asked him where we were going, and he said, we're going to my cousin's farm. I wandered away along a ditch that ran besides the road, and all of a sudden I noticed this dark blue object, something like a large potato, dark blue, lying in the grass. I picked it up, felt cold and heavy like metal. It had a shiny ring on one end of it. I put my finger through the ring and I pulled on it, and it came out in my hand just as Leon called that we were leaving. So I tossed the object over my shoulder like this, and it fell in the ditch apparently, and I ran to the rickshaw. When I jumped onto the rickshaw, there was a loud explosion from where I had just been, and Leon started pedaling much faster than before. It was only years later that I realized that this dark blue object was a German hand grenade. And if Leon had called me a few seconds later, it would have exploded in my hand. So once again, luck. And then I also learned that with the uprising now in Warsaw, any Poles found by the Nazis near weapons or explosives would have been shot on the spot. So if there had been any Nazi soldiers within earshot, they would have tried to find us. And if they did, they would have shot all of us. So double luck. I was with Leon on that farm all through the end of 1944 into January. In the first week of January, all of a sudden, my mother appeared. I had not seen her for 6 months, so I didn't know when I would see her, or even if I allowed myself to think about it, whether I would ever see her again. So that was probably the happiest moment of my childhood, when I saw my mother alive after 6 months. Now, about a week or two later, I remember I was sleeping and my mom woke me up, and she had tears in her eyes, and she told me, "You are saved." No, I didn't know what she was talking about, but she took my hand and pulled me out of bed and dragged me behind her. I was half asleep, and I knew we were going to the main room in the farmhouse. And when we got there were soldiers there, but they didn't have the dark green uniforms of the Nazis that I'd seen. They had olive uniforms. And my mom bent down to me and she said, "They're Russian." Well, when the Russians, one of the Russians had a different uniform, I figured it must have been the officer. When they saw me, I was the only little kid in the room. So this Russian guy, officer, he reached into his pocket, took out a little white cube, and he handed it to me like this. But I didn't know what it was. So my mom said, "That's sugar, take it, taste it." So I put it in my mouth, and I swear it was the best taste I've ever had my whole life to this day. And ever since that moment, I've got a tremendous sweet tooth. I can start dinner with dessert for the main course, and end it with dessert. And I would do that occasionally, except my wife never lets me. She's right, I know. I call that moment the Sugarcube Miracle. Um, about a um, about a week or two after the Sugarcube Miracle, we learned that the Russian army had already pushed the Nazis out of Warsaw. So my mom and I returned to Warsaw, and it looked like this. By the way, most of it we were walking. Sometimes we get a ride with military trucks, but mostly long walk. And Warsaw looked like this, except there was a lot of snow, and occasionally among the ruins I could see in a pile of snow, half covered, a body or so, or two, left over from the battle between the Nazis and the Russians. Within a very short time after that, my mom got a job with a brand new book publishing organization whose job was to print books and propaganda. And because she had been an attorney before the war, her job was to reopen bookstores throughout Poland, because most bookstores were closed during the war in Poland. In order to get to some of those further out cities, you would need transport. Public transport wasn't reliable or wasn't existent. So she was given a car and a driver. It was sort of a car. It was a little old pre-war three-wheeler. The wheels were about half the size of a normal car wheel, one little wheel in the front, two in the back. It was rickety, it was smelly, it was noisy, it was always breaking. Her driver was always fixing it. And her driver was given a machine gun and she was given a pistol. And the reason for that was that whereas in the Warsaw region, the Nazis had killed off most of the pro-Western underground during the uprising, they would have my mom and her driver would occasionally need to get to some cities far away where still were leftover pockets of pro-Western underground who were resisting the communist takeover. And they knew that only the government owned cars, so they would attack cars on the road. My mom and her driver never needed to use their weapons. So again, they were lucky too. Now, next slide, please. This is what you see. The next slide is, this is my mom and me. This is the summer of 1945. Apparently the three-wheeler must have died, so we're now in a Jeep. She was given a Jeep. So I'll read to you part of a chapter called Summer 1945, Returning Prisoners. Several times during those early months after the war, my mom and I went to the railroad station on news of trains arriving from Russia, carrying Polish prisoners from the Eastern Front. My father, a reserve officer before the war, was called to active duty during the war's first few days, and he was sent to the Eastern Front. My mom had hoped that he had been taken prisoner and would be returning from Russia on one of these trains. My mother was understandably filled with hope and anticipation as we waited for these trains to arrive at the station. But for me, it was a strange and an unsettling mix of expectation and concern. On the one hand, I wanted a father in my life, and I was quietly envious of children who had one, like Leon's daughter. On the other hand, I had no memories of my own father, as I was only 1 year old when he left for the front and never returned. So this train for which we were waiting might bring a total stranger into our life. And I could only hope that he would like me and that I would like him. Together with a lot of other people, we would stand at the station entrance and watch as the gaunt and bedraggled men filed out slowly and wearily. They were gaunt and bedraggled because they were prisoners in Russia for years. Sometimes there were joyous shouts as the waiting and hopeful spotted one of their own, followed by much embracing and tears of happiness. Mostly, however, the arriving men shuffled by ungreeted, perhaps because they were not from Warsaw and had to travel further to find their families, or perhaps because there were no survivors and their families to greet them. My mother was always quiet when we left the station after finding no one. We would walk home in total silence. Now, that was a very happy time for me because I was living with my mom, and my hope was that I would continue to live with her as long as I was a child, and not like it happened um, during the war. Well, that's not quite what happened, because in 1947, 2 years after the war ended, um, my mom put, like in early 1947, my mom put me on a train together with other group of other Polish, sorry, Jewish orphans or half orphans. We were going by train to France, and France we board ship and sail to Palestine, not Israel, because Israel wasn't founded yet for another year and a half. Why was my mom sending me away? I don't know, and I never asked her. But the question only occurred, I guess I learned not to ask questions because maybe I wouldn't like the answers. But maybe the question only occurred to me when I was writing the book, which was 10 years ago, 11 years ago. My mom died 16 years ago at the age of 91. So 10 years ago, I could do some research, look at places like Wikipedia. What happened during those first 2 years, 45 and 46 after the war, that would have my mom send me away, presumably for my safety. And I learned that there were pogroms through many of the smaller towns and villages in Poland. By pogroms, I mean were mobs of angry anti-Semitic Poles would seek out any Jews that survived in their town, survived the war, drag them out on the street, beat them, kill them. Polish anti-Semitic mobs killed several hundred Jews during those first 2 years. And here's a paradox. The Jews that they were killing survived the war only for the same reason that I survived the war, because Polish families risked their lives to hide us. That makes no sense, does it? Not at all. Except for one thing, we all have a choice as we grow to maturity. Are we guided by hate and anger and prejudice and racism? Are we guided by tolerance and all the things that our parents taught us about humanity and about justice? We all have that choice, and you will too. I would probably be living, next slide, please. This is my passport photo. I was 8 years old for the trip to France and then on to Palestine. I would probably be living in Israel now, but it was an accident, but except for an accident. One evening I was in France with that group of other kids. A couple of us were roughhousing, chasing each other. I tripped, fell, and this tremendous pain in my leg. And as I was lying there crying, one of the adults came over, started to lift my leg up, and I just screamed with pain. And I remember him telling somebody, I think his leg's broken. We better take him to the hospital tomorrow. Well, that doesn't sound serious to you or to me now, but it was very serious to me at that moment, because right after the war, I saw so many people without arms or legs that I just assumed, I was sure that if you break an arm or leg, that they'd cut it off. I was sure of that. And one of the kids with whom I was playing kind of knelt down beside me and said, hey, don't worry, you'll be playing soccer with us tomorrow. I thought, how am I going to play soccer? I'm going to spend the rest of my life on one leg. And I obviously didn't sleep very well that night. The next morning, they took me to the hospital, and when they were putting a cast on my leg, hip to toe, I asked the man who took me there, I said, why do they bother doing this? They're just going to cut my leg off. He laughed at me and said, no, don't worry. They won't cut your leg off. They're going to put a cast on, and they'll take this thing off. In a couple of months, you'll be as good as new. I was one very happy little 8-year-old at that moment. They sent me back to my mom in Warsaw. The rest of the camp went up to Palestine. But 2 years later, early 1949, I was back in Paris with my mom. Next slide, please. This is summer of 1949. I must have turned, I turned 11 then, so that maybe that's my birthday photo. How did that happen? How did we get there? My mom did such a good job establishing bookstores or opening bookstores throughout Poland that the Polish communist government decided to send her to France to open Polish bookstores for the Polish immigrant community in France to try to entice them to come back. My mom did set up a number of bookstores. We actually, my wife and I, some years ago, stumbled onto one of them, Polish bookstore, which probably my mom had set up decades earlier. But that summer, my mom defected. She went to the American embassy, applied for a visa for herself and for me. Her visa came through very quickly. And in September, my mom left for America. My visa didn't. So once again, my mom had to find somebody with whom to leave me. She found a Polish-French couple in Paris, and I lived with them for several months. During the days, I would wander all around Paris, learn enough French just by listening, so that whenever I got lost, I could ask somebody in French, how do I get home? They would explain to me in French, slow French, but they would explain to me. And I understood enough, so I always got home. But eventually, my visa came through, and on the 1st of December 1949, this Polish-French couple put me on an airplane in Paris. My mom met me in New York. About a week or two later, it was about a week or two later in New York. And then from New York, we took a train down to a small town, tiny town in North Carolina called Cove City, 1,000 population. That's all, 1,000. And so there was like middle or late December. In January, when school opened, my mom right away put me into school. I had been in 5th grade, so in Poland, so she put me to 6th grade. The problem was that no one there spoke Polish, and I didn't speak a word of English. So the first few weeks were very tough. I made some major mistakes that at that time were very embarrassing. Now they're funny. So if we have time, ask me about them trying to teach me baseball, because that was the most embarrassing one and the funniest one. But eventually, I picked up enough English. I was flown by a year and a half. Oh, the surprising thing is that everybody there had a heavy Southern accent. I learned English from them. I didn't pick up the accent. My only explanation is that perhaps my Polish accent was so heavy, it kind of kept the Southern accent away. I guess it works for me. I don't know whether it's correct or not, but it works for me. So I was for half of the 6th grade and 7th grade in Cove City, North Carolina. Then that summer of 1951, we moved to Oregon, another small town. It was Forest Grove, Oregon, about 30 miles away from Portland. By then I was already fluent in English. So my mom took me right away. That was that summer for an interview with the principal of the small high school, maybe 300 kids, small high school. And he interviewed me, asked me lots of questions to see whether I speak English well. Do I understand it? Can I answer? How much do I know? And apparently I passed all the tests, because he allowed me to skip 8th grade and start as a freshman. Freshman year was really tough on me. First of all, I was only a year and a half in America. So I was still not used to American culture and American habits. And I kept making mistakes that were embarrassing. Not as bad as North Carolina, but bad enough so I was embarrassed much of the time. Number two, I had a heavy Polish accent. I was the only kid in school with an accent. That was embarrassing. And besides, that's an embarrassing age. You're going through it perhaps like I did. The worst of all for me was I started to stutter badly, very badly. I think it's probably the memories of the Holocaust started to register in my head. So I had those strikes against me. 4 years later, I graduated. During that time, I did everything, learned everything the kids did, including baseball. During the summers, they all worked in the fields, picking strawberries and picking beans, and so did I, to make pocket money. Then my last 2 years, I was already big and strong enough so I could work in sawmills. All the pocket money I saved, because I thought that once I go to college, I would buy a used car because I love cars. So I was saving it. One thing happened to me in my junior year, my 11th grade in high school, that I want to share with you, because if that happens to you, something like that happens to you, I hope that my story will help you. A vocational counselor came to our high school in beginning of our junior year to try to help us decide what elective courses to take based on what we're going to do after high school. Are we going to work on our parents' farms? Are we going to work in sawmills? Are we going to become loggers? To help us choose the right electives. When it was my turn, he asked me what were my plans. Well, ever since then, I wanted to do something with airplanes. And once I knew that it was aeronautical engineers that design and build them, I decided I wanted to be an aeronautical engineer. So I told them, I said, I want to be an aeronautical engineer. And he said to me, well, you're probably not smart enough for that, but you'd be a really good car mechanic. Well, I love cars. And when I bought my first used car, I had to fix it myself because I couldn't afford to pay anybody to fix it. And I could do that. But I didn't want to be a car mechanic. I wanted to be an aeronautical engineer. And I thought, why is he discouraging me? His job is to help me. And it kind of occurred to me that maybe he's discouraging me because he got discouraged himself. And I thought, I'm not going to let him do that. I'm not going to let him discourage me. But I realized I better study harder if I wanted to become an aeronautical engineer. So until then, I was getting A's and B's and sometimes even C's. But after that, I started studying a lot harder and I got nothing but A's. And the reason I'm telling you this is that if there's something you want to do in your life as you grow to maturity through school, through high school, through college, whatever, anytime, and you want to get there and you're willing to work hard for it, and that's the crux. You got to be willing to work hard for it. But if there's something like that, don't let anybody discourage you. I didn't let him discourage me. And in my senior year, I went to my math teacher because I liked him, asking what is a good college for aeronautical engineering. He said, well, the best one is MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I've never heard of it before, but I thought, fine, I'll apply to it. I was very naive. That's a nice way of saying stupid. And that was the only college I applied to, MIT. I had no idea it was very difficult to get into, but I was also lucky and I got in. And altogether, I spent 8.5 years studying at MIT. I got 4 degrees, 2 in aeronautical engineering, 2 in nuclear, including a PhD. After MIT, I worked in the aerospace industry. I was on one of my jobs was a great job. I was on the team that designed, my specialty was rocketry, rocket engines, rocket systems. And I was on the team that designed the variable thrust rocket engine that lowered our Apollo astronauts controllably to the surface of the moon. It was called the LEM, Lunar Excursion Module Descent Engine. It was a great job. I loved it. Eventually, after MIT, after aerospace, I started traveling to Russia, representing American companies in Russia. And I did that for 25 years. During those 25 years, I probably made 200 trips to Russia. But through all of those 60-some years, I kept the Holocaust at an emotional distance. I never wanted to see any movies. I never read any books, never talked about it. None of my high school classmates knew about my childhood because I never talked about it. In college, only my best friends knew about it. I didn't want the Holocaust to do to me what it did to my mom, because my mom, who died 16 years ago, the Holocaust never left her. The Holocaust traumatized and followed her all through her until her dying days. And I didn't want that to happen to me. So I just kept the Holocaust at a distance. Then, 10, 11 years ago, my mom had already passed away, 5 years, 6 years since. My wife asked me if it's okay to rent a movie called Paperclips, which takes place in the year 2004 in a small town, small middle school in a small town in Tennessee. I don't want to go into this, but I asked my wife whether it has any Holocaust scenes, because I don't want to see any Holocaust scenes. She said, no, it's all a documentary of what happened in this town in Tennessee. So I said, sure. But when the movie ended, we saw it at home. When the movie ended, I realized that my story has value. So my wife asked me, probably for the 20th time, whether I would reconsidering my refusal to write my story. I surprised her, surprised myself. I said, I'll do it. Started the next day, the very next day, finished 3 months later. Next slide, please. I finished it like in March of 2010, and I thought I was finished. I was finished with the Holocaust. I was finished writing the book, but that's not quite what happened, because my best friend in Boston from college, who still lives there, he knew that I just published a book, and he told it to the organizer of an event that was being staged on April 10th. That was the Holocaust Remembrance Day, and an event was being planned at the Holocaust Memorial in downtown Boston, and it was handled. This was done by the Rabbi Michelle Fisher. She's an MIT grad. And she asked me whether I would come to Boston and speak at that event. My first reaction was hell no, because I was afraid. It was too close emotion for me to get in front of an audience of strangers, even though these were all MIT people. But I realized I was being a coward, and I realized also that I already had tickets to fly to Boston, because I was and still am on a number of MIT committees. So I was supposed to fly to Boston for MIT committees. So I decided, no, I'm not going to let my cowardice keep me out of it. So I said, okay, I'll do it. And I practiced and I practiced. However, when the event came and I learned something about the Holocaust, about the Ghetto Uprising that I didn't know before from the previous speaker. And then Michelle Fisher said, okay, George, it's your turn. So I got up there and I kept choking and speaking and choking and speaking. But I eventually got through with it, but it was very painful. But enough people walked up to me immediately afterwards and said to me, you got to keep doing this. You got to keep telling your story so it's not forgotten. So I've been doing it. Since then, I've spoken this is probably my talk number 285 or something like that. Almost, I'm going to get to 300 talks by the end of this year. That's over the last 10 years. But when my book came out, I immediately put it on free access websites. You can print it on your printer for free. You can read it on the computer for free. Friends asked me to have it available hard copy, so I put it on Amazon. It's like $10 there, but it's free on scribe.com. I was also interviewed by a newspaper reporter in San Francisco, where I live, and she asked me whether I have a website. And I said, no, why? She says, well, since you'll be speaking in schools, students will be interested. Why? They'll ask questions. So their questions and your answers would be good if you had it on the website so other people can read it. So I did start that website, neitheryeslys.com. And yeah, since then I've been speaking a lot. 90% of my talks are in schools, like yours, or high schools. And the reason for that is that you guys are old enough to understand what I lived through, what I survived, but yet you're young enough to have an open mind and to decide for yourself whether you want to live your life on the side of fairness and truth and tolerance, or on the side of hatred and anger and intolerance and racism and violence. You might have had to make the choice already. If you were ever walking in school or out of school and you saw somebody being bullied, what did you do? Did you just keep walking and let the bullying continue, or did you stop and face the bully and say, stop that? That was a choice you made. Later on, you might see tougher stuff. You might see mob actions, beatings, maybe even killings. It's happening in parts of the world now. It happens in the United States. 2 years ago, a gunman went into a synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, killed 11 parishioners. Then a couple of, the year before or the year after, there was an anti-Semitic march in Charlottesville, Virginia. one person was killed. And when asked about that, our then President Trump said, well, there are some very fine people on both sides of the issue. No, there are no fine people on the side of anger and hate and racism and violence. All the fine people on the side of tolerance. So I've been speaking ever since. And I'm often asked, what can we as individuals do? As individuals, when faced with hatred and prejudice and racism. And my answer is speak up, stand up and speak out, speak out. It turns out that hatred and prejudice and racism and anti-Semitism, they grow in the darkness, but they fade when exposed to the light of day. So if you say to somebody, when they say make some anti-Semitic or some racist remarks, you say to them, hey, I want to hear that again. Be a little louder. I want to hear it. I want my friends to hear it too. They would usually back off. It takes courage, but they would usually back off. So I hope that when faced with racism, anti-Semitism, prejudice, that you guys build up the courage to speak up. That's why I'm here with you today. Thank you very much.
George, thank you so much.
Questions?
Yes. Do we have time for questions, Ms. Sheridan?
Yeah, about 10 minutes.
Perfect.
So what I'm gonna start with the 8th grade, let them, and I'm gonna assign somebody to type the question, and then I'm gonna run into the 7th grade and make sure that they know how to do the same thing.
All right. We would love to see the kids if you can put the cameras down.
I don't know how to do that, but I'm sure they do.
Okay. I know they do because they did that when we first came in.
Okay.
Okay, here's the question.
So if you have a question, do the question to Daniel, short class.
Yeah.
Okay, here's the question.
Yeah. Kale, can you repeat the questions? I can't hear them.
And I did not hear that one either. You know what? Both ones are on
We didn't hear the
mute.
question.
We're gonna type them into the chat.
Oh, we're going to type them into the chat. All right. I will open my chat and I will start looking.
Yep.
Well, your message today,
Yeah.
George, is exactly what we need to hear. We are seeing an an increase in hate crimes, in anti-Semitic, which means anti-Jewish hate crimes. And things seem to be getting really tense and polarized. One question, what hit you the hardest emotionally about the war?
Well, I will tell you this. The reason it's very difficult for me to answer is that the reason I called my book Neither Yesterdays Nor Tomorrows is that the people that kept me, they saved me. I'm very grateful, but they weren't always nice to me. And I've learned instinctively to forget bad things from the past. I really forget bad things to this day. I mean, like in a hang glider, when I was heading straight for the hill, big boulders, I remember I blank out all the negatives. When I was hurt, when I crashed and was knocked unconscious, I remember nothing about it. Same motorcycle accidents, because I survived them and didn't get hurt. I remember everything if I wasn't hurt, but if something hurt me emotionally, I forget it. And therefore, I cannot tell you what it is that struck me the most, but what has the main effect I think it has on me was that I learned to blank out bad things from the past to this day. And I also learned not to look to the future, because I never knew when I would see my mom or whether I would ever see her. So I refused to look to the future. I know that in business, it's important to look to the future, but I've done okay. I have no complaints about that. But when my wife sometimes asks me about something, I said, no, it's more than a week away. We don't have to worry about it. So that is the main effect I think it has of the war, that I'm such an optimist that I always think I'm going to survive it all. And so far, so good, you know. And I don't have any bad dreams. I know that people who survived the war have a lot of bad dreams. I don't. I don't dream, actually. I don't dream. And maybe I just block it all out. I blank out all the bad stuff.
Wow.
Next question.
Wow. Yes. So Ms. Hansclass would like to hear the baseball story.
Okay. Maybe the first or second or third day, you know, at school, the kids started teaching me baseball. At that time, there was no baseball in Europe at all. So I knew nothing about it. And somehow I picked up the idea that there are 5 strikes in baseball. I don't know why. So maybe the first time I was up at bat, I hit the ball. Second time I hit the ball, but the third time or whatever, fourth time, I struck out. So I'm standing there waiting for another pitch, and they kind of motioned me to get up home plate. I said, no, I want 5. I go, I want 5. And they're telling me, no, you only get 3. I want 5. I keep insisting on 5. Finally, a couple of the bigger guys came up, picked me up by my armpits, carried me off the field, and just threw me bodily into a big field of tall grass. And I just went sailing. And for the rest year and a half that I was there, the kids would sometimes ask me whether I wanted to take a flying leap into the grass. That would oblige me. That was very embarrassing. I couldn't say anything because all I could say is, I want 5, I want 5.
Oh my,
Anyway.
well, it makes sense. You got a whole hand. You might as well get a whole hand of strikes, especially if it was me having to hit a ball with that tiny little stick. We have some questions about your time with Polish families and what was the hardest part of living with non-Jewish families? And do you ever think of what could have happened if you hadn't have had their help?
Well, first of all, what would have happened is, I would have had a much higher chance of getting caught. But I think the reason I survived is that I didn't know I was Jewish. I learned I was Jewish only, I was raised together with their kids. You know, I started living with them when I was 4 years old. And you know, when the kids were praying, I would pray with them. You know, I was just told, you know, I would ask the kids, you know, my age or younger, you know, why do you pray? And I was told, well, because we get better food if we pray. So I prayed with them. It was only after the war that I learned I was Jewish, and I'll tell you how that happened. Summer of 1945, right after the war ended, a couple of us were playing in the courtyard in Warsaw, and one of my friends, he called somebody, you know, he was a neighbor, a friend. He called somebody, and so we were 7 years old. He called somebody a dirty Jew, and I said, well, you know what? I guess I was liberal then. I'm liberal now. I said, well, you know, there are good Jews and bad Jews, like there are good Poles and bad Poles. I said, you and I are good Poles, but there's some pretty bad Poles too. He didn't agree with me, so we started arguing. Then we started fighting, and he got bloody, and I got bloody. When my mom learned about it, she told me I was Jewish. Well, I wasn't willing to fight for the Jews and defend them, but I didn't want to be one because by that time I already knew what happened to Jews during the war. So I just started crying. I mean, I threw a crying fit. Obviously, I got over it, but that was a big blow. Well, after the war, communist Poland, there was no religion. So the only religion I was raised with was the Golden Rule, and my mom did a very good job in training me so that I really believe in the Golden Rule religiously, and that is treat others as you would like them to treat you. And I do follow that rule religiously. So that has maintained my religion.
And every religion in the world has some form of that golden rule within it. I think do we have time for one more?
Exactly.
Okay, last question. And this one's loaded. Can you forgive those who hurt you, including the Nazis? Have you been able to forgive?
The answer is both yes and no. And I'll give you 2 examples. I'll give you an example of forgiveness. A couple of years ago, I traveled to Poland where I speak in high schools, both in Warsaw and in the surrounding areas. And one of the high schools in a nearby town. They told me that they just have a group of high school students from Germany. It's okay if they come and listen. By the way, I speak in English. I had forgotten Polish. That's another example. Poland was painful for me. So within 2 or 3 years of leaving Poland, I forgot my native language. And to this day, I travel to Poland, I don't speak it. So I'm speaking English, and the Polish groups that I speak to, they all speak very, very good English. So I gave my talk to this group that had maybe half a dozen or a dozen German visiting students. And there was a girl in the second row, I noticed, who kept staring at me very, very intently. And when I ended my talk, she almost jumped up and came to me very quickly, and she said, "I'm one of the German students here, and what you're telling me about your story is so different from what I hear at our dining room table when my parents and grandparents talked about the war. And now when I remember what they were saying, I feel ashamed of my parents and my grandparents." And she started crying. So there's like 100 some kids in the audience. She's standing there crying. And all I could do was put my arms around her and hug her and say, "Hey, what your parents or grandparents did or thought is not your fault. Your job is to tell what you know and to pass it on to other students." So that's that's a good part. Let me tell you a bad part. My first office mate, when I worked in the aerospace business, was a German rocket engineer that was brought in with Werner von Braun to help our rocket program. And he and I were roommates. And we never talked about the war. He was a pilot, and I would fly his airplane. He had a glider, and I even went and we flew his glider. So, but we never touched the war. I knew he had to be a party member, because he wouldn't have been working in Piemonte, which is where they design rockets, unless he was a Nazi. But we never talked about it. Until one day, all of a sudden, I don't know what happened, but he all of a sudden said to me that the worst thing that happened during the war was the Allied bombing raids, it's fire bombing raids on Frankfurt and Dresden, where 100 or 200,000 people, citizens, were burned to death because of the firestorms that these whole flotillas of British and American bombers threw down these fire bombs. So there was this firestorm that swept through the city. And he said that was the most horrible atrocity during the war. And I looked at him and I said, "Well, what about the 20 million total and the 6 million Jews that the Nazis killed?" And he said, "Well, it's a totally different story." I realized he was a non-repentant. I went to the management of the company. I said, "You get me out of his office, or you get him out of my office. I never want to be in the same room with him again." Yeah.
Oh,
And there are people, right? And I'll tell you this, there are people there. I used to hang glide a lot with a guy, but we never talked about the Holocaust because I denied it, or I kept it in emotional distance. Eventually, he learned about my childhood. He tried to convince me that the Holocaust didn't happen. When I told him, "Hey, everybody in my family except my mom and I were killed." No, it couldn't have been the Germans. He said, "Good, I remember this." He said, "Because Hitler and the Nazis abhorred violence. It had to be the Poles that did it." I told him, he at that time had moved to France. I said, "I never want to hear from you again." But the fact that an adult could deny something as obvious as that, and there are other Holocaust deniers that are the same thing.
which is why we are
Nothing will
so
convince them.
grateful. Yeah, this is why we do this every week or every year, is to get your story out and to teach more about the Holocaust, because there are still people who want to deny and distort the facts of what had happened then. And so we are so grateful to you, George, and St. Mary's, because you do this every year. Thank you for having us back in your school again this year. I'm going to send Carol and Becky the website, your website, and your book information, as well to get that out so that they can download that book, because I think the vignettes, I want more. I know I want more. This is my first time hearing George's story. So thank you very, very much for doing this for us today.
And George, thank you. We look forward to hearing you tomorrow with our other schools.
Yep.
George, we
Again,
really
I appre-
appreciate you coming and talking to our really small school. It means a lot to me, who is very passionate about teaching the Holocaust to my students, and allowing them to have the opportunity to hear firsthand. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Small schools are the best schools.
And I really appreciate the opportunity to give back. I do this because I've been lucky, and this is my way of giving back. So I thank you for the opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And George, we'll see you tomorrow.
Bye-bye.
See you tomorrow.
Thanks,
Bye.
St.
Bye.
Mary's.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jen.
Bye-bye.
George, see you tomorrow.